thank you very much for this presentation. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm super happy to be with all of you here. And actually, I'm here to stay. I'm going to be here on Friday. So Friday is my turn also in the seminars. And I'm very happy to be presenting this with Eva. First, because we've been working on this for a long time. It's the result of many discussions and many other things, and many paellas, aliolis, and as it was discussed before. But also, in special, I'm very happy to be sharing with her also this great moment for, I don't know, for you, because London, I would prefer to stay here in New York, and especially knowing the super fun life that you have here. But it's a great thing for our collective karma that AA has chosen you with this amazing 67%, which I'm very impressed, majority. Okay, let's go to the fact. Okay, this is one of the projects that the Office of Political Innovation we've been developing, but actually these photographs are not that good in showing what is that we're intending to do with these projects. Basically, I'm very interested on the architectural objectuality, like what is the architectural objects, but not as isolated things, but as hairy things that are expanding in connections with other things, in disputes, in love, in hate, in many other things that somehow expand them in different scales and make them things that actually this is something that we discussed together in Guangzhou, I remember, or this is with Sejima. But in a way what I'm interested on is all these hairy people, lights, air, toxicity that expands buildings beyond their actual dimension. Actually, this is something that is not something that we choose. When you look carefully to, for instance, the conditions of this island in Corpus Christi, where we're constructing this house, it's basically that it's been totally destroyed with the recent environmental events that happened in Texas. You see that actually architecture is very much suspended in all these hairy relationships, and that architecture in a way has the responsibility of caring for them, of caring for the way that architecture contributes to the making of moons, of multiple moons, of toxicity, of the color of the air. And that is something that it's the center of our work. The one that we did in the past and the one that we're trying to do now. Okay. I'd like to talk about, to start, before we talk about sex and the city, actually let's talk about cats. Cats is everywhere, and this is gata niebla, cat fog or whatever. What I'm very interested in is the fact that she's standing on this travertine slab that probably many of you recognize as part of the Barcelona pavilion. The reconstruction in the 80s, in the 1980s of the pavilion that Lily Rai and Mies van der Rohe constructed in Barcelona in 1929 together with many other people. There's all these theories, and I'm very interested in them, that have to do with the fact that the Barcelona pavilion is not creating space, let's say, but is creating subjectivity. That is actually producing personas, let's say. It's giving space and is also engaged in the production of bodies, subjectivities, ways of thinking, dimensions, but also a way of being in the universe. And in a way that's true, but for me not in a symbolical way, but in a very practical way. This is the first photograph that was taken in the Barcelona basement, in the basement of the Barcelona pavilion. And I took it not that far away, a few years ago. What is very interesting for me is that the pavilion has this invisible basement. A basement that was never photographed before, not as a closed space, and that is the container of so many things, like for instance this broken glass that so carefully has been placed there on the wall. When we look at all these things that happen to be there, what I'm very excited about is that in a way they're telling a very different story of the pavilion. It's a little bit like a cavern, like the grotto. Where you don't see the pavilion, but you get to see glimpses of it, but glimpses that are slightly different to the ones that you see in the postcards. This is, for instance, the material that used to cover the lake where the Kolbe sculpture is. Actually, this is where the Kolbe sculpture is. This column is holding it, is taking the load to the foundation. But this plexiglass panels started to curve with the sun, and they were removed. In a way, all the experiments that were showing that the materiality of the pavilion is not something that you can do at once, instantly, coming from Miss Head and immediately being translated into architectural form or technology, like this door that was placed there is the first one that was placed in the 1980s, and it was too heavy. The frame of it the steel frame was too heavy for the mechanisms that are holding it to the floor and the entering to the floor and the ceiling, and it has to be replaced by a new door with a lighter frame. So all these elements that are denying the possibility of doing the pavilion at once are kept there. When we see, for instance, these broken slabs of travertine that are taken there to be fixed, we see that the composition is not that different to Lily Reich and Mies van der Rohe work. Even the numbers that are used are kind of Futura numbers that are very much the ones that maybe in the Verbund they would be using. So this is not that different to the whole tradition that Lily Reich and Mies van der Rohe were activating, and there's something that obliges it to remain invisible. When the velvet starts to look like this, it's taken down to the basement in a way that is weird, like it becomes a little bit of a phantom. But still, it needs to be preserved, which is exactly what I'm interested on. The fact that they need to make it invisible, but still, it needs to be preserved, and it's preserved a little bit like in a museum, in a modern museum. So these are the two sides of this pavilion. On the one side is what the misnowers, all of us, want to see and want to confirm when we go there, the images that we've seen in the books that we want to, again, photograph and put in Instagram, and post in Instagram. And then underneath is this other story that needs to be hidden in order for the upper floor to work, like the Dorian Gray portrait a little bit. But again, when we see what happens here, it's not that different to the collage, for instance, that Mies van der Rohe was doing himself after the construction of the pavilion, and the ones that are putting together people like this naked man with other things in kind of heterogeneous compositions. This is the basement, as you can see it here in the floor in the section plan, and this is the way it looked when it was being constructed. All this for me is crucial because it has to do with what is architecture about, which in my opinion is not that much about providing a neutral space for society to happen. It's not an empty box that any form of society can fill in. It's rather the construction of that society, society in itself. So architecture is the making of society, it's society. And that's something that is very, very clear when you see this guy here that is not allowed in the basement. It's very, very literally what the two-story building is doing. This is not an architectural mistake. It's not the result of a bad design. It's not the fact that the staircase was wrongly designed. It's actually the result of a very good design that was fulfilling the intentions that they had. Christian Civisi, Ignacio Solá Morales, and Fernando Ramos, the architects who designed the reconstruction, wanted to prevent that in the future any new director could have the possibility of using the basement as a place where the pavilion could be interpreted. And in order to prevent the pavilion to be explained and to save it from future directors, they decided to design a staircase that in no way could get license for the visitors to get there. The way to design the constituency of the basement was actually going through that wrong staircase that in no way would basically make everyone hit their heads with the ceiling and would in no way be allowed to give access to the general public. Our work, the work of my office, is very much like the work of many other social forms like Grindr or like IKEA or like Mies. It's about rearticulating the social. So basically we operate in these ecosystems trying to change a little bit the way the agency here of all these different actors are relating to each other. So what we do is basically the pavilion, we took the things from the basement and took them up there. For instance, the water lilies that are no longer in the lake because there's salt and chlorine that is taken there, but we put again all these process, that all these elements that are not making it or preventing it to be in the lakes in a way of unblack boxing why there's no longer water lilies in the upper part of the pavilion. Okay, this is an introduction to Sex and the City, because what I'm going to tell you about now is not different to the work of Mies van der Rohe and Lily Reich in the way that they're prescribing and producing the social, but what is producing the Mies van der Rohe of this moment, I would define, is Sex and the City. If Mies van der Rohe had the capacity to reconstruct societies in the 1920s, it is now Darren Star, the author of, or the person that promoted Beverly Hills, the Golden Girls, Melrose Place, Sex and the City, what probably is prescribing what are the societies we're living by. And this is what we've been doing in Storefront. I'm very interested on the fact that Sex and the City, as Samantha would love to say, is putting together the two major passions of our times, love or sex and real estate. If we look at the way the characters look in the first episode of the first season, we see that they're very different to the last one, in the last season. Basically, everything has changed. Their thrift store clothes by Patricia Phelps have gone into something very different. The interiors, the Sarah apartments in Lexington Avenue have been replaced by other things. Even the gay friend is no longer the same in the last episode. And gayness is a good marker to understand what's happening here. All around the world, in major global cities, the venues for gay life, the venues for those spaces where LGBTQ communities were empowered, like for instance in Chelsea or the Meatpacking District in New York or in so many places, or Hell's Kitchen, have been replaced by apartment towers. This is something that many people, like Saber Sarth, the owner of La Escuelita, for instance, denounced. And all around the world there's been demonstrations to confront this process. What is very interesting is that the same locations that in the past were places for emancipation for the LGBTQ communities all around the world have been replaced by these high-end condominium towers. High-end condominium towers that, as we could see when we did this research, 3-year research on Grindr, have become the locations where Grindr users have chosen to, it's like the favorite location for Grindr users to switch on their app. So there's something that remains there. Gay people want to switch on their apps with the fantasy that they might get lucky with someone that is living in one of these amazing from high to ceiling glazed apartments by the mediation of Grindr. What is very interesting for us is that in this process, a big part of the queerness that was part of the LGBTQ communities is being erased. The process by which New York responded to the construction in 1962 of the Elizabeth cargo or container port that grew with the Vietnam War and that took all the economy of New York Harbor to New Jersey, and that challenged the New York economy and made it possible for the gay scene to find cheap venues in places like Hell's Kitchen or Chelsea or the new Meatpacking District, has been challenged by the process by which different mayors and different forces decided that New York would become an offshore location, a non-offshore location where money could be laundered and could be storage in high-end apartments that rather than become a place that could be inhabited in an ordinary basis, became a way of an asset-oriented way of inhabiting. That process that was very much reflected by the way Grindr became no longer a space of queer emancipation as it was in its origins, but became a place where J.W. Anderson would show his fashion shows, where Paper Magazine would be finding their models, where so many things were sold with the action of Landy Smithers, the marketing director of Grindr, that was the one that removed, that before was the marketing director of Playboy, and removed the naked bodies in Playboy to make it family, to make the magazine family oriented, is something that then happened to queerness. So when we look at the gay friend of these characters, in a way, he's very much representing, showing, enacting a huge transformation in the way gayness and gay sex is being part of New York City. And by looking at that, we can very much understand the economical, architectural, urban transformation of the city in the last 20 years. Everyone knows this, of course. But this is actually a rendering. This was built before the actual tower was built. And actually, this is the result, probably, of this famous Bloomberg mandate to make the city attract billionaires. As he said, it could be a God sent. But actually, that was not something that was spontaneous. It was very much designed. For instance, it was the moment with Bloomberg that New York City allowed LLCs to be used as sole corporations to hide the ownership of condominium towers or condominium or condominiums in this kind of towers. This is the moment in which basically New York started to attract all this capital that was storage in these apartments. That was also part of the 1972, what started in 1972 tax deduction for billionaires in the property taxes that they would pay to the city. So basically, billionaires would be paying, following the 421A Act of the city, would be paying less than 1% of their property taxes, whereas the rest of the people in New York would pay much more than that. In a way, what I'm very interested in is that this mandate or this project by Bloomberg to react to the crisis that Elizabeth cargo or container port caused in New York City by transforming its economy and the way Bloomberg ended up or supported a line that started in the 1970s to transform New York into a non-offshore location is very much an architectural contribution. Actually, I would defend that the main contribution in 432 is not, in terms of architecture, is not Raphael Vignoli, who's normally recognized as the official architect of it, nor is Deborah Burke. It's actually Matthew Bannister, the director and the CEO of D-Box, the rendering company that did all the kind of previous life and online life of 432. This is one of the first things they did before the tower was constructed to solve some of the condominiums. They produced these images in which a ballerina would be dancing in the windows of the 432. But they were placed at this magazine that they did that was strategically located in the rooms of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Moscow, together with the catalog of Dior. So in the middle of the night, when the billionaires are staying in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, jet-lagged billionaires would try to find something to do. They would open the magazine and they would find the 432 and they would basically move their fingers touching the coated paper of the magazine and touching this kind of body floating in the air. This is actually what D-Box did to architecture. What they did to New York is, in a way, a pornified process or a pornifying work of sexualizing New York City. Where does it come from? This is one of the first images that D-Box did in regards when they were one of the first projects they worked for high-end apartments or condominiums project they worked for, which is the Gary Tower. But I'm very interested in seeing what's happening here with this shirtless guy with a beard, kind of reflected mix like that. Because if we try to find where this comes from, it comes from D-Box. From Cocky Boys. Cocky Boys is gay porn studios that are based here in New York City. They started to operate in 2006, more or less. And it was the moment that porn studios were moving from San Fernando Valley to other locations. Porn was no longer something that was that stigmatized. And Jake Jackson invented a form of porn that was very much connected to interior design. He reproduced kind of trendy interior designs in Hunters Point, in their studios in Hunter Points. And they started to work with J.C. Sebastian, that you see here somewhere. He will be there at one point. That developed a technique to shoot in front of windows. So he could actually adapt the lens both to the light of the people having sex inside the interior and the view outside, which is something that was a little bit complicated and you would never see in San Fernando Valley's porn. What I'm very interested on is that Jake Jackson was not coming from porn. Even though he declares to be a pornographer, he was actually the owner of a company that is called Media Notions, that he owned in partnership with Glenn Greenwald. Glenn Greenwald, probably all of you know him because he was the journalist from The Guardian that was releasing the Snowden papers. He was he was part of the leaking of the Snowden papers. This is a photograph with Laura Poitras and Snowden, and it was part of the same project. Media Notions was a company that was had as a mission to unblack box the American secrets as a way to produce a new society. And one of the secrets were, of course, the secrets of the military services, but also it was gayness. And to expose gayness for them was the same project than exposing NSA. It's very interesting that actually the whole plot exploded when Glenn Greenwald became such a celebrity, and then everyone looked at the other business, and then they saw that Jake Jackson was his partner, and then they broke up. These are some photographs of, these are the typically, for those that are not familiar with Cocky Boys, these are the typical scenes that they would do. Scenes in front of windows. And I'd like to pay attention to actually Alan King, one of their exclusive models that you see here, because these photographs were the reference with which D-Box produced this. So basically, porn is the origin, a very particular kind of porn that was also revealing secrets like or leaking secrets like the Snowden papers, the one that is behind the language that D-Box used to produce these fantasies. This is a rendering, of course, with there were photographs taken in a studio in Queens, in a chroma, and then replaced or kind of relocated inside a rendering. But I'm very interested in what happens in this scene. Of course, the first thing is this Christina Makovsky. It's the Sport Illustrated model that was made up in a very particular way. So she would be appealing both to the Asian, to the Middle East, and to the Western publics. She was probably many of you recognize her clothes. They're very much a version of Kim Kardashian's famous Lanvin shirtless suit. But of course, in the case of Christina Makovsky, it's an Armani version of it, a little bit more respectable. But what for me it's most interesting is what is happening in the second scene. What happens here, this guy here, I mean all these are actors and models, but this guy here, this chubby guy here is not a model. is what in D-Box they call the Danny DeVito guy. The Danny DeVito guy is actually a real businessman, very close friends of Matthew Bannister from New Jersey, probably with business related to the container port. But this is the one that is making believable to someone that maybe in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel at 2 in the morning, jet lag, will be moving his fingers, her fingers, on the coated paper, and will be having the fantasy of making love to probably this woman by just having the possibility of imagining to buy these assets. In a way, sex is not something that is performed as we thought it was performed in the past. It's something that is happening in magazines, in investments, in renderings like this, and we engage to that in a very different way now. I'd like now to see why they invested so much in skies. They're doing all these efforts of having amazing views in these buildings, and in these renderings, 80% of the image is just a blue sky. Actually, this is not an accident. This is the first image that was produced by D-Box to explain what was their strategy to sell the apartments, that was basically filtering a little bit the sky. So as you see, when you get to the 432, you see the sky, but slightly different as you see here. That's as simple as that. But that's something that goes very much with the detailing of the architecture. So this is not an immaterial process. This is not a strategy that has to do just with ideas, with imagination, with fantasies, with whatever. It's actually transforming the building. Or is the building, the materiality of the building is a key actor here. This is the glass that was used, the Excel glass that is used in the 432. Is the most expensive component of the building. It's much more expensive than the elevators. That the implications of this in the overall cost is much higher than any other thing. And this is an Austrian glass that is used, that is basically filtering and polarizing the light. So the blue part of the spectrum of the light is exaggerated. This is not something that happens only. This investment. Material investment in producing the sky, and actually producing the sky because these windows cannot be opened. So basically, there's no way to compare the sky filtered by these glasses with the other one, with the actual unmediated one. But this is not something that was only designed at the scale of the building. In 2012, Bloomberg, the one that was trying to attract billionaires, approved a $100 million plan project, the clean heat program, to transform the fueling of heating in New York from oil-based to natural gas. This is very interesting because basically, within 1 year, they reduced 26% the emissions of nitrate dioxide. Which is particularly the component of the polluting component that turns the blue color of the sky into brown. So basically, the whole program was meant to do what the renderings had been doing before, what the Excel glass had been doing before. It was rendering at the scale of the city the same effect of eliminating the brown color within the air. The Blue Air project was a project that was very much celebrated at the same time that New York was becoming natural gas dependent. So if in 1 year the city doubled its provisions of gas, of natural gas, what is very interesting for me is that that particular year that the city was needing more gas than ever, it was precisely the year that New York State banned fracking in New York City. So at the same time that basically the city was requiring someone to extract gas, that extraction could never happen, no longer in New York State. Where did it go? Where did all that brown component of the earth, all that environmental cost went to? It went to Susquehanna Valley. Susquehanna Valley started to produce gas, increase the production of gas through fracking, and therefore the toxicity of Susquehanna grew at the same pace that the one in New York City reduced. The Marcellus Shale became the provision of energy for New York City at the time that New York City was preparing to attract billionaires by getting blue and environmentally sensitive, let's say. But I'm very interested is what is the way that fracking is perceived. This is the amount of gas wells or wells that are operating now in Susquehanna Valley. This is the way fracking looks from above, but this is the way it looks from below. Basically, fracking is very much of a landscape design project, one that makes it almost impossible to perceive what's happening there when you are close to on the ground. This is actually the closest you can get to a fracking pad legally, and this is the way the borders are designed, so it really looks like a very sweet thing. The perception of the effects of fracking are very much perceived by the people living there as a magic event, as a poltergeist thing, as a kind of esotericism. So it's a new form of magic, a new form of kind of paranormal event, a little bit of a phantom thing, like the Barcelona pavilion has a place for phantoms. In the basement, Susquehanna has actually a very particular relationship with what happens down there that is, again, like phantom appearances. Like this woman that can burn the water from the tap because it gets mixed with gas by the way the well is being affected by the drilling and the way it's channeling gas. What for me is interesting is the asymmetry between the way this action in the underground is perceived by the people that are living above and by other sectors of society. Matthew knows much more than me about this, and he will be talking on the 31st on the representation and the technologies that are used to track mineral assets in Susquehanna. But what is very interesting is that this is the technology that Graphic Dynamics, together with General Electric and with Baker Hughes, developed to monitor, to map, to sense what is that is happening down there. And whereas this is the way the surface is divided, basically underneath there's a huge consolidation of the ownership of the properties, of the mineral properties. So this is again a little bit like the Barcelona pavilion, a two-story reality that is segregating societies in different groups. Is creating actually different types of being, or different types of humans. The ones that are perceiving fracking as a kind of esoteric thing, as a magic thing that they don't make sense of, and those that have this huge equipment, this capacity of introducing sensors in the 12 bits and sense what is happening down there. But it's very interesting for me is that this is becoming a new Grindr. People don't make love to other people. They basically move their hands or their fingers looking at assets in social media like this asset performance management. A very tiny part of our society is really doing something else than moving their fingers and changing the Grindr profiles, but they're doing the same with assets. And by doing that, they get connected to these mineral domains that for most of the people are just fantasies or ghosts, but that they can control and they can stabilize, of which they can stabilize their prices. So in a way, what I'm very interested on is the way Sex and the City is a project of segregating society to an extreme that is very difficult to understand without really accounting for the architectural, territorial, and spatial uses and the way people perceive reality in different manners. This is something that goes from the scale of mineral beds to the scale of genes. This is the photograph that in 2009 Sarah Jessica Parker released, her publishers or public advertisers released of the birth of her twin daughters. But it's very interesting for me is that this was very much a responsive image, is an image that was trying to confront another image that was already circulating in the Daily Mirror. This image of what the Daily Mirror called the tattooed bisexual rocker who was pregnant with Sarah Jessica Parker's twins. And this shows how difficult it is culturally, politically, visually to visualize surrogacy. Michelle Ross, here on the right, is the person that was the surrogate of Sarah Jessica Parker, and it was something that is becoming progressively popular among wealthy couples to go through surrogacy, or embryo screening, combination of three-parent sex cells to produce children. But this is something that is in the core of New York City. This is in Columbus Circle, Dr. San's New Hope Fertility Clinic, the most growing economical activity in the city of New York now is fertility. And this is in particular the room they have for fertility treatment for celebrities in Columbus Circle. But for me it's very interesting is that this goes together with many, many other technologies. This is Lookalike, a service, a cryobank service that sells sperm according to the resemblance of the donors to famous celebrities. This is actually the donors that claim to resemble to James Franco. I don't know whether they look like James Franco. Maybe this guy, not that one, maybe. But that is not an accident. James Franco and Jean Host are the most demanded celebrities in donations, because basically they're people that could be equally attractive for the Western publics and the Asian publics. They are a little bit in the middle of the stereotypes of what a Western and an Asian person is, and therefore they're connecting the biggest market in the world with the biggest factory. And this new production of humans that is happening in the core, in the center of New York City, and that is becoming its main economy now, the fastest growing economy, is something that is connected to the technology that enables to control assets. So in a way, and I conclude with this, something is happening here. New York City is no longer becoming an accommodation for experimental societies like the LGBTQ in the 80s, but it's becoming actually the center of the production of segregation. Segregation that is not something that happens immaterially, but is a material transformation that goes from the deep of genes to the deep, again, of mineral rights, and that is happening in a way that some people are perceiving this as a process that they can control, just moving their fingers on the borosilicate screen of cell phones and iPads, and for others is part of an esotericism that they don't make sense of. And this is the project Sex and the So-Called City that is meant to provide the blueprints of this project that started with Sex and the City, the TV show, as many others started with other projects by Darren Star, and that it's the reality by which we all live by. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's incredible to see that what you presented is probably just a fragment of the work that it is exhibited at the storefront, and the work that you have produced is what I call a contemporary form of forensics in understanding, right, the kind of political and social constructs that make the built environment. There was a debate in 1978 between Chomsky and Foucault that was called On Human Nature, right? And there was a very heated debate that was not unlike the proposition 1 and 2 of Banham that you introduced in this lecture. But so Chomsky was saying that, you know, there is something that brings us all together. There is a human nature, there is something that makes us all feel, react to certain things. And Foucault was like, no, He's like, no, in fact, those same ideas are actually constructions. The only task that we have as philosophers or artists or architects is to unveil the politics and the structures that have constructed our ideas of self. So in that way, the idea, and some people in this room might be able to respond to some of those questions, for Foucault was the only task that we had was to unveil and to bring certain ideas of truth to the images, to the text, to the realities, to the politics in front of us. And it seems to me that your work is that. But your work as well, as you showed at the very beginning with some images, and maybe those were the images of Igor, there is an architectural project in the most, let's say, canonical form of the word, in which you're interested in the building of particular forms of engagement that in and of themselves, sometimes like the one at PS1, unveils a reality but produces a kind of a simulacrum of a machine, of a performance, or a billboard for a certain message. So in terms of the question, I would like to ask you, how does one reconcile, right, that kind of investigative project, that kind of research project, into a project of architecture that is usually the inside box, that is that meta-discursive space of lineage in which we learn orders, materials, technologies. And I'm saying this with the fact that I'm looking into a pedagogical project that I think needs to reformulate what are the fundamentals, what are the foundations of architectural education. Because one doesn't learn any of these in architecture school, right? One learns other things. And so the question is, how do you as an architect that was trained through a very classical form of understanding architecture, has found a space of practice that is a much more political, loaded, strategic and powerful form of engagement with the world outside of us, think of his own practice and his own way of thinking pedagogy. So how do we train architects today, and how do you practice as an architect that takes this research into build form?
Yeah, super good question, super difficult. First, how to train architects? I think the process of unveiling, mobilizing these realities, connecting them, is a process that cannot be done alone. It's a collective process. So I think that a way for me, for me, architecture is producing these connections, unveiling these realities, and operating immersed in them. So there's two parts project, I think. One is really creating the environment in which you're operating. And I think every architect has the responsibility of producing the environment in which he, she, there, whatever he want to operate. So it's not a given. And I think that we have to understand that as part of our job. As any other scientist, for instance, would immediately understand that he, she, there, whatever want to do or need to do. The other is you immerse there very soon, and then you start operating it, transforming the connections, moving them. For instance, we're now working with some of the people that are here. We're working with Cocky Boys. We're doing a glass house for them in which they will be shooting. So in a way, what I see is that we're doing an alternative window to the one that D-Box designed, and in which other kind of bodies, relationships, territorial connections will be done in the future through the shooting of a different porn. So we're already operating here, but the only way for us to operate here is constructing our environment. The same we're doing with Barash Robbins, one of the most important activists, counter-fracking activists. We're working with her also to have her also producing different evidences that will change probably the conversation that she's having in Susquehanna. So in a way, I have the feeling, I always remember this idea that Renkoll has said, that before he could start designing, he had to spend some time to make space for the architect he wanted to be. So I think that in a way we all go through the same process of creating the ecosystem in which then we at one point we're part of and we operate in. The second has to do with pedagogy. For me, pedagogy, in the way I do it, in the way I imagine it, is something that deals with the conflicts of daily life. So I'm not happy with the kind of pedagogy that is about transmitting a knowledge that was formulated 30 years ago, that we very much control and we can teach someone to operate there. I'm very interested in the fact that we're lost in the world, surrounded by so many conflicts, and that we can use the tools of design to navigate that. The tools of design are the tools of measuring, recognizing connections, challenging them, pushing them a little bit, And those are right tools, very good tools to be in the world with. And I think the act of pedagogy is sharing this uncertainty and this purpose of making sense, navigating this mess with others. And on the way, everyone creates different paths that somehow touch. For instance, we have a path that has to do with funeral homes that touch probably your work, the one that you presented in Seoul. We've been talking of many things that touch the work that you've been doing for many years in Storefront, with touching things that have to do with the mineral assets that touch the work of Matt. So in a way, we create kind of a network of people that are linked by these ecosystems. Yeah.
I mean, I think for me what is more interesting is to open it up to the audience, and then can react as well and bring. I think it's a great presentation, and I think you brought many issues, and many of the thesis students are here in the room, and also some of your words provoke a lot of the base of the pedagogy of what Cooper Union has been as well through many years. So I think like this is a real challenge, right? In some ways, and I think the fact that you are here also teaching this year is a great way of really shaking, but at the same time having this conversational engagement with a history of pedagogy that was pretty hermetic, but I think is also trying to understand the real power of that precision of measuring and articulating those pieces. So I would love to open it up to the auditorium. Who has the first question?
Or complain.
Or complain.
Or a petition. I have more porn if you want.
Let's elaborate a little bit your question of measure, because that was the one mechanism through which you speak about a device that we somehow all share, and it becomes a way of gauging our context or constructing that context.
Yeah.
There is little that's uncertain about your own architecture, and the only way you get there is through specification.
Yeah.
And with all of the uncertainties of pedagogies, and with all of the changing circumstances of the social and political realities around us, there's this moment that any architect has to pull a trigger. It's probably an extended moment because you have to specify over days, sometimes weeks. But it produces a very particular set of spatial relationships, formal relationships, material relationships. And by now, you have produced the sediments of a particular aesthetic and modus operandi. And I would like, on the coattails of Eva's question, is to open your palms to exactly what drives not so much your pedagogy, but those prejudices and biases that you confront as you do your own work, because I think that will reveal something else about this discussion.
Yeah, in a way, I think this is the last work that I've done. I don't make a big distinction between, for instance, when we design a building and when we do this. When we design a building, like, I don't know, we're doing an apartment building now in a beach, and immediately all these components emerge there. Infrastructures, people, economies, regulations, and a similar ecosystem happens there, and we can operate reconstructing the connections between them, basically. So for instance, we're designing this apartment building as an extension of a villa. The villa was constructed by a family that wanted to have it as a holidays location. And now the family is evolving to a number of groups of people that no longer have that much money. They want to do some apartments so they can transform the villa into a source of income for them. This is something that could be described in the same terms that we do here. It's a project that has to do with money, economies, expectations, and our take is really take into account, for instance, hidden actors that are not part of, for instance, the meetings in which we are, but that they are, because they're there. for instance, the waste, or for instance, what will happen in the future, or what is the sustainability of that economical project. Things like that become then crucial in the project that we're doing then, which is very specific, very ordinary. That's the way, for instance, we work in the Placentia Clergy House. We understand probably that every architectural and design take is a take on an ecosystem that is operating at different scales. In the Placentia Clergy House, it was basically, there was a 15th century building that was the minor seminar, that because the Catholic Church is not attracting that many seminarists, people that want to be priests, but they have many old priests. The building has to evolve to accommodate that transformation. And in the same way, the building was really relating to this huge ecosystemical transformation. So, in a way, the way we work is not different to what we're doing here, reconstructing the story, connecting it to other actors, bringing the confrontation that is already there to the, let's say, hegemonical narratives, putting together D-Box with Susquehanna Valley, which is something that probably no one did before. And this kind of recomposition of the ecosystem is what I believe design is about. And of course it requires many things. It requires structures, it requires pipes, it requires many things, form, it requires images, it requires colors. And when you get to the detail of the design, those things make a difference. If you put it in a different color, that connection is maybe not happening. And that is the way I imagine design, and the way I think we practice it. Did this respond to your question?
Only at the very end, because you gave it a little bit. But there was a moment in which you were speaking as if all of this happens in a deterministic way or in an unmediated way. But my sense at the very end is that there's this very critical moment of you as a producer anticipating reception. The need for translation from one modality to another, and the role of manner distinguishing between this type of work and another type of work. We all have choices, and we don't design the same way, and that's what with historical hindsight we look at the work of Ponti and Dominioni, and we know they're not the same. And we know they stand for different things because the process that pushes their work in the same era are motivated by a different set of questions.
Yeah,
and that's what I'm trying to get at in your work.
Yeah, no, it's true what you're saying. I don't think this narrative is deterministic either. Like,
I didn't think so either.
No, but we could connect these things very differently.
Yes.
The narratives are constructed, and we could tell the story very differently. And this story is mainly told in a very different fashion most of the times. So this is one of the stories that we could construct out of these materials. And in the same way, design is very much a construction. But this doesn't mean that it's not true. This doesn't mean that by not being the only absolute universal narration, it's not mobilizing many of the facts that this is about, or of what this is about. And this is for me very important, like the possibility of a single narrative is something that probably would, at least myself, I don't believe on. And this is something that I really want to inhabit. The narrative of this woman that is far in the water is totally different to the guy that is basically doing like this and seeing Susquehanna. So what probably urbanity or the city is about is the encounter of these different notions of perceiving reality. For me, the city and the tradition of urbanism is no longer contained by the patch in the land of a city. It's a little bit more complex. It's happening probably in the encounter of these different ways of relating to daily life, to resources, and if in the past architecture was mediating in the production of the urban by doing squares, for instance, I wonder what's the way we can mediate now in these very conflicted encounters of difference that are segregating in space, in time, in scales. But that's why I think it's important also to produce the laboratories in which we can start having glimpses of this.
There is There is one thing that, I mean, thinking about ideas of measure and precision, I remember once walking in Madrid into a bar that I didn't know it was your bar, but somehow I entered the bar and I thought of you. And in fact, it was Andres' bar, right? And what was incredible is that one was not being reminded or told any story or narrative about the politics of the space, but there was a very calibrated disruption of your feeling and understanding of where you were, right? And so those connections maybe were more sensorial or static in some way. And so my question to you goes, I mean, you have shown us a lot of moving images, a kind of a total overload of GIFs and flickering canvases. And so my question here, like in a kind of a tradition of Rancière, right? The politics of aesthetics.
Yeah.
And how you are producing a specific vocabulary with specific colors, right? There is a tendency towards the fluorescent, there is a tendency to the overload, there is a tendency to the kind of digitalization of the surface without being digital. There is some pop and there is some camp, and I would like you to talk about what things do you think are essential to the kind of investigatory processes and the kind of a project that Office for Political Innovation is doing, that is much more of an anecdote to your practice versus that what you think is intrinsic to your practice.
Yeah.
So do you think that your work has an aesthetic, and does that aesthetic carry its politics? Or for you there is a politics that still hasn't found an aesthetics?
Yeah. I think there's no way to do politics without aesthetics. I think aesthetics help us sense the world. Like by showing the world through the filter of a certain, or reconstructed to certain aesthetics, we're making it sensed in a very different way. Like for instance, the images of the assets, these digital graphics that we see here, are very much science-oriented, versus the images, for instance, of these photographs that are very much of the realm of activism. So aesthetics are producing our location in very particular realities. We're located here as activists, where we're located here as scientists and investors. So the role that we play in a particular contingency very much depends on the aesthetics filters we use to be part of that. And I agree that this is something that comes from the queer and the camp traditions, for instance, and the Pride movement was very much about, for instance, using aesthetics as a way to occupy space, as a way to rename and to reconfigure the meaning of certain possibilities in society, and a way to force others to perceive them differently. In the same way, the aesthetics of devots are very much prompting these apartments as part of a high-end world. So the way for the apartments to emerge as components of the international jet-lagged high-end world is to very particular aesthetic calibrations, and that's why Matthew Bannister and the D-Box people are so good and so well paid, because they're using those aesthetics as a way to sense things in a very particular way. And for me, that's the role of aesthetics. Of course, we don't always get it, so we try, but that's our intention. We also think that that is something that is moving all the time. For instance, I don't think that we will see this within the same aesthetics in 6 months. I think predicts this software will probably evolve into a very different aesthetics, because I don't think that this is very much effective in making people aware of the power that it comes with assets, for instance. I think it's much better, these other graphics, for instance. And in the same way that I don't think this is working that well as aesthetic, like the fact that we don't really see the possibility of producing children like James Franco through this website is showing that there's something of the aesthetics of this that are really not working. So aesthetics are in the making for all of us, not only for the Office for Political Innovation. Yeah.
Have you seen the film that just came out called Annihilation?
I know.
So
No.
I just think it's really relevant to your work. So
What is it about?
it's like it's a horror film, but it just kind of addresses a lot of issues of representation.
Okay,
things like that.
I will watch it. Yeah.
How does this kind of research and these sorts of narratives directly feed into your design? I think you sort of circled around that, but I'm just trying to understand how some project like this would directly feed into the design of a building.
This is my design.
Right.
I'm
no, I
installed here.
understand that. I agree with you that this.
No, what I'm trying to say is that in 6 months, this story will have a glass house that is the Cocky Boys glass house. And in 2 years, probably there will be other things. This is my design. I could tell you the story of the Catholic Church. And at one point, there's one character that is the Placentia Clergy House. Or I could tell you the story of New York Water. And at one point, one of the characters is Cosmo, the installation we did for the PS1. So this is the beginning of design, or not the beginning. I've been working for a long time on this. But let's say that we're very slow on producing our projects. And our projects are not something that comes from clients. Let's say we start working. At one point, we're changing things in the same way that we're connecting things or reflecting things. And this is something that has to do with pedagogy. What I believe about pedagogy is that it's very much a personal project, or a project that you do with others, but it's a project in which you construct the space in which you operate. And that's something that is slow, but it also empowers you. Because when you have your laboratory, which in my opinion is this, you then are the one that are operating with other people. You have your network of friends to work with, your network of enemies to confront. You have your... for me, this is very different to the way of working of people that are just, for instance, in their office, and then they get a call from someone and let's do a hotel, and then you do a hotel. When we work, in a way, we're constructing these ecosystems, and at one point, we also do take phone calls, but then we start doing this again.
Like the Cocky Boys were at the opening of
We're
the
at the
show
opening.
at the storefront. So
Yeah.
like you invite your agents to your openings in that regard for sure.
And there actually, it's very interesting because in a way, it's, for instance, the one part that I didn't show is about also prosthetics. And the Cocky Boys have been investing on producing masturbatory devices. But that's an extension of the bodies of the models. So basically, they cast the penis and of the most important models, and then they reproduce them in silicone, and they sell them. So it's a project that, again, where they're transforming the world by, they're doing something not that different to what we do. They're producing these narratives that at one point they need to produce devices to transform them, to extend them. And for me, that's not that different to what we do. And
They cast them flaccid or erect?
erected. Yeah, erected. But you can. That's an open debate. That's an open debate. I think it's erected. I hope so. Yeah.
Like, yeah, otherwise this is scary.
Yeah.
More questions?
Sorry, a second part.
Yeah.
So if you have a client and there's a commission for a project, do you go through the same process of
Yeah.
research?
Yeah, basically we do that. We start, there's many clients that get very annoyed because we ask too many questions. And we've done all sorts of things. We had many, for instance, there was a moment that we were experimenting many things. There was this family that came to our office. They had a very beautiful house that was designed by a Barcelona super stylish architect. And they got divorced, so they decided to divide the house in 3 parts. One for one of the partners, one for another partner, and the kids that they had would be living in the middle. So by opening doors, they could basically distribute the time that they would spend with their kids. So there was a few days that this door was closed and this one was open, all this. But then everything changed when one of the partners got a new partner. And then there were too many people, the doors were really not working. So we were asked to transform the house to adapt it to the new person that arrived to the family. And we asked them to wear some watches, Casio watches that would do beep, 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 beep every hour, and to have a notebook so they could describe in the notebook when that sound, what is that they were doing. So, what is that you're doing? Okay, I'm cooking breakfast, I'm doing this. But they got super annoyed after 6 months, and they decided not to do to sell the house and buy different houses for each one. So yeah, but that's basically so that we really try to develop methodologies to extract information. But I must tell you something. In the long run, it's really working commercially as well. Because you become an expert on the context of other people, and people get addicted to you, literally. Like they really need you to explain what is happening to their lives. And this is something of a very weird relationship that at one point becomes a little bit vicious. But yeah, we're there.
For example, could you tell us?
Yeah, many examples. Many examples. When we did the house in Neverland, for instance, that was a bit of a weird situation because we were explaining everyone what was happening there, what was the connection to the valley, to the ecosystem, what was the connection between their home in Ibiza and their way of living in other places. And yeah, I think it was important to design also the way we could remove ourselves from that ecosystem at one point, because we became too needed for that to keep going. We became a little bit the narrators of it. So yeah, we had to remove ourselves. And we decided. So it was we thought of a way to progressively disappear. Now the house has, and these people have their own thing. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you a very difficult question that you may refuse to answer. You have taught advanced studios in many schools, and you have been teaching probably for the last 15 years, or maybe more. If you were to teach the first year of architecture in any school, right? From Madrid to Princeton, or Columbia, or anywhere where you are, what are the fundamental aspects that you think an architect needs to get today in their first exposure with the idea of architecture?
Yeah, it's a question I have to ask myself every day when I'm teaching. It's a mandatory question, I think, for any teacher. For me, the main question is this. And the main thing that I do, I don't know if there's some people that... the main thing I try to do is to show people that architecture is not something that will happen in a few days, but we're already architecture, all of us. Our connections, our lives, our bodies, our shoes, our daily life, it's architecture. So if we started to unpack what is happening here, this is all architecture. I couldn't be talking to you guys without this table, without that projector, without the curtains. So the situation that we're in is the result of a huge amount of design calibrations. And for me, emerging as an architect is more gaining the capacity to operate in an already existing architectural realm, rather than inventing a new one, rather than imagining new architectures out there in our models. So it's more something that is all around here than something that is on the table there. And that is a fundamental change. If we think, for instance, of all these images of people with models, I think you know many of these pictures, we see that probably that's, at least from my point of view, a position that I don't identify with. I have the feeling that architecture is all around, and that we're struggling to make meaningful contributions to that already existing architectural realm.
I think that's an incredible way of closing a talk of an individual that I think is participating in that act of redefining what is that architecture is, and the way in which we might be redefining it in the near future, here or anywhere else in this world. Thank you, Andres.
Thank you.